technological resources of our day. And if you're out there as a guest online, you're just sort of kicking the tires, trying to find out what Keystone's all about, maybe just wanted to hear one of the messages or see something of the experience, we're glad you're doing that. But you should know that our heart really is that you'll be here with us, embodied as soon as possible. And so we'll pray to that end. You let us know if there's something we can do to help you along those lines. Drop us a question or a comment, send us an email, whatever we can do. We'd love to serve you from a distance. And if you're part of the church family and you're not here today, sick, traveling, whatever it may be, we'll look forward to when you're back just as soon as possible. But at this time, we're going to take our Bibles and we're going to open them up to the book of Matthew. First book in the New Testament, the second half of your Bible. If you don't know where that is, then want the table of contents. You can find it quickly that way. But get those open to Matthew. If you don't have a Bible, there's some guys coming up the aisle right now. They want to put one in your hand so that you can have one today. You can certainly use an electronic device if that's easier, but especially if you don't own a copy of the Bible, we want you to have one. Just slip your hand up. They'll give you one. You can borrow it and leave it on the seat. Or again, if you don't have one at all, then take that one home. It's our free gift to you. We don't want you to miss out on what God says in His Word about you and about His world and everything taking place in it. There was a missionary couple named Des and Jenny Oatridge who served with a group called the Wycliffe Bible Translation Ministry. They were sent by the Lord to a group of people in Papua New Guinea called the Binomarian people. And they first arrived in the 1960s with their baby daughter to live among a very remote tribe of people that had never heard the gospel even one time in their own language. In fact, they didn't even have a written language at all. Everything in their culture was oral. So they had never read anything. They had never written anything. And so obviously when these missionaries arrived, their first task could not be to jump straight to Bible translation. It had to begin with just figuring out the language itself. And it took years. For years they studied and they learned and they discussed as best they could with the Binomarian people. And they eventually were able to develop a written form of it. And then they started to teach those people how to read and to write in their own words. You can imagine how slow and painstaking that work was. It took more than a decade just to get to the place where there was a written language that the people understood. But eventually they accomplished it. And as you can imagine, they were then very eager to do the real task they had gone there for, and that was to translate the Bible into this newly written down tribal language. And so they decided to start that project by translating the book that is open in front of you this morning, the Gospel of Matthew. And eager to move quickly to what they believed was the real heart of the story, which was the life and the teachings and the miracles of Jesus Christ, they made an early decision to skip over a few verses here in chapter 1 that contains the genealogical record of Jesus Christ, His family lineage, the first 17 verses. That's going to be our text for this morning. They assumed that these verses really weren't essential to the gospel message itself, and so they were like, we'll return to it later. It's not like we won't ever translate it, but we're going to skip over that in our first edition. Well, several months passed as they worked on their translation, and it was eventually finalized. They got it printed. They were able to have the copies shipped back, and so you can imagine their excitement when these very first copies of the book of Matthew arrived in the village. They were hopeful that the people would celebrate and be excited to really have their first book in their own hands. They were giving a copy to everyone in the village. But much to the dismay of the Oatridges, the response of the people was actually quite minimal. They were polite, but they seemed pretty unmoved. In fact, they were actually more interested in the vehicles that delivered the shipment than they were the books themselves. And Des and Jenny, the missionary couple, they would later describe that season as one of the most devastating of their entire missionary experience. They were so hopeful, and yet they ended up so discouraged after more than 10 years of labor when it seemed like the books were just discarded as useless by those local people. But they didn't quit. They persevered, and eventually they decided to publish a second edition of Matthew, and this time they included the genealogical record. And so when those copies arrived, this time they were shocked to find out that everything was different. Shortly after receiving the updated edition, in fact, the chief of the village itself called a meeting, a formal meeting, and he asked Des to come and read the opening 17 verses out loud for them. And so in a crowded, tense room, Des sat down, he read the genealogy as the people followed along in their own copies of God's Word. And when he finished, everybody in the room sat there in stunned silence. And Des and Jenny, they weren't sure what to expect. They didn't really know what was going on. What was it about these 17 verses that the chief wanted to hear so desperately? They actually thought that maybe they had crossed some kind of cultural taboo and maybe they had angered the village. Maybe they were upset with them. They had no idea what was coming next. But when Des looked up after completing the reading, he was surprised to see amazement in the eyes of the people instead of anger. The chief pointed down at the page in front of him and he said, "What is this?" And Des replied, "It's the historical record of the family line of Jesus." And the chief paused for a long time again and he said, "Are you telling me that this Jesus really lived? That he was a real person?" Des said, "Yes, of course." The chief pondered again for a long time and he said, "Wow, that changes everything. We thought you've been telling us a story about a mythical spirit, one of our legends like so many others in our culture." And Des reported that from that moment on, everything in their ministry changed. See, among the Bonamarian people, nobody ever spoke of ancestors, of their spirit beings that they had worshiped for generations. Only real people had genealogies. And so once they understood that Jesus was not a myth, he was a real man who lived at a real time in history, and that God himself had stepped into human flesh, the chief finally understood the gospel itself and put his faith in Jesus Christ, and soon after, the rest of that entire tribe followed. Get this, not just because the story of Jesus is beautiful and impactful, but because the genealogy proves that it's true. And here's what I find so particularly fascinating about that story. See, we live in a world that I would say really operates in much the same way, don't we? I mean, we often assume that the most meaningful stories that we encounter in culture cannot possibly be true, right? We're told that they're myths, that they might be beautiful and moving, but as inspiring as they may be, they're not real, right? The movies we watch on a screen, the books we read, that's why we expect our heroes to live on those screens, not in history. It's too good to be true, right? A few years ago, a literary critic named Anthony Lane reviewed the epic stories of the Lord of the Rings in a magazine called The New Yorker. And he actually praised the author, Tolkien, for his creativity, but he actually took issue with people who enjoyed the story too much. He said this, quote, he wrote that to fully give yourself to fairy tales betrays a reluctance to face the finer shades of life that verges on the cowardly. You understand what he's saying? In other words, grow up, says Anthony Lane. Stop believing in heroic quests, happy endings, right? Triumph of good over evil. That's not reality. That just lives on a page. But here's what I want to say to Anthony Lane, and I really want you to think about today as we look at this genealogy together. I would ask, why is it then that in every single culture in the world, in every generation that has ever taken place, all of them tell stories like this? Have you ever thought about that? Why do stories about rescue and sacrifice and redemption move us? Even unbelievers move our culture so deeply. Why do we love stories like Beauty and the Beast about a love so powerful that it would break a curse? You thought about that? Or Sleeping Beauty about people trapped under a dark enchantment who need a rescuer to come and save them? Why does a story like Peter Pan resonate with us? This idea that we've forgotten who we really are. We're blind to the real reality of what's around us, and we need to wake up and remember. Or even modern stories that move us in the same way, like the superheroes. Think like the Avengers, right? This godlike man, this human in a godlike shell, right? Iron Man, remember this guy? He ultimately sacrifices his own life to save the entire world. Or Superman, a god from another place, another world, who would come to save and protect humanity and even lay down his own life for others. You understand what I'm saying? Why do stories like this never get old? It's the same story we're telling over and over and over again. Here's why. Because deep in the human heart, there's actually a longing that realistic fiction cannot ultimately satisfy. It's why we want to hear the story again and again. We want the rescue that they promise. We want supernatural intervention. We want love that never fails. We want the death to ultimately be defeated. And so when a story like that touches those longings, something within us responds every time. Doesn't matter how many times we've heard it before. Even when our minds are saying, that didn't really happen, that can't be true, our hearts whisper back, but it should have. But we want it to, right? And that's because all the best stories, ultimately, are really true. Not the fairy tales themselves, but the longings that they awake within us. They're all just echoes, glimpses, shadows of the ultimate story behind them all. They're all borrowing their power from the greatest story that has ever been told. The need for a rescuer, that is real, my friends. The dark enchantment we find ourselves under, absolutely real. The noble prince who comes to save his people at great cost to himself, nothing could be more real than that. And that is what the Gospel of Matthew is all about. And that's also why Matthew doesn't begin his account here with the words that most great stories use, which would be once upon a time, right? He doesn't do that. He starts with a genealogy. He starts with names and generations and history because he's telling us, guess what? This is not mythology. This is not a moral fable. This is not just a good story. It is real history. The story of Jesus Christ isn't one more story that points to some vague spiritual truth. It is the underlying reality to which all other good stories point. There really is an evil sorcerer, and we really are under his power. There really is a noble prince, and he really has come to break that enchantment. There really is a love that never fails. And as we sang this morning, that hope has a name, and his name is Jesus Christ the Lord. And so in that sense, all the best stories are real because they're all shadows pointing to the substance of Christ himself. J.R.R. Tolkien, the man who wrote The Lord of the Rings, he understood this better than most. Look what he said. All the beauty in the world, all the great stories are like scattered pages of a book whose binding is Christ. Isn't that great? Scattered pages. See, that's what the world feels like without the genealogy of Jesus. Beautiful moments, stirring stories, deep longings, but really no way to hold them all together, no binding. But when you see that Jesus is real in history, when you trace his lineage back through David to Abraham, as we're going to do in a moment, when you realize that all the best stories are really true because he is the reality to which they all point, suddenly the scattered pages of all those stories, they come together. And suddenly it all makes sense, doesn't it? That's why we're starting this sermon series today. We're going to call it The King and His Kingdom. And it's going to take us a long time, so buckle up and get ready. I mean, like months we're going to be in the book of Matthew, maybe a couple of years, I don't know. But for the next season of time, we're going to walk line by line, paragraph by paragraph through every single word of the greatest story ever told, the Gospel of Matthew. We want to meet the King of Heaven who came to establish his kingdom. The one who did not come through military might or political power, but through a humble cross and an empty tomb. Matthew wrote this gospel to show us that Jesus is indeed the one true king that the world has always been waiting for. And that every single promise that God made in the Old Testament, every prophecy about a coming Messiah, a Christ, that it would all come together in the person of Jesus. We're about to learn that he is the son of David, meaning that he's the rightful heir to the throne. He is the son of Abraham, the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all of the other nations. And he is, get this, the very Son of God. He has eternally existed before time itself as the second person of the triune Godhead. So I'm excited to jump in this morning. I would invite you to read this important genealogy with me. I'm going to read it out loud. You follow along silently. And as we read, I want you to hear the footsteps of a faithful God who has been marching through the corridors of history straight toward you, my friend. I want you to see that all the best stories really are true and that you have been personally invited into the greatest story ever told. I'm calling today's sermon the unstoppable king behind every good story. In Matthew 1:1, the word of the Lord says this, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. These are God's words for Keystone Bible Church today. Let's ask His Spirit to come now and help us learn them well so that we'll be equipped to live them out really well in the week ahead as we pursue the mission of this Jesus who is the Christ. If you're a note taker, and I hope you are, then I would encourage you to write down this big idea that sits over today's passage. My story always has hope, because no sin or setback in history could stop the King. That's why this genealogy matters for us today as we begin this journey through the book of Matthew. See, some of you walked in here today and you're, truth be told, you're weighed down by your past, aren't you? You think back on mistakes that you can't go back and undo. You think about failures that you cannot forget. Others of you, you're staring at a future that frankly seems uncertain, like you don't know where it's all headed, and you're wondering if God even sees you or if He even cares about the things in your life. Some of you are frankly worn out from trying to hold everything together in your life and measure up to the expectations of people around you. And I'm telling you, this genealogy speaks straight into all of that. Because what Matthew shows us is that God has been writing one story for thousands of years through triumph and tragedy, through faithfulness and failure. And nothing has ever derailed His plan. Not sin in the lives of His people, not exile, not silence, not scandal. And if God's purposes could not be stopped by any of that, then I promise you, whatever you're facing right now in your life is not going to stop Him either. That is real hope, friends. That is hope that is anchored in a King who came to do exactly what He promised, exactly how He promised, and to do exactly what He promised, to save His people from their sins. It's the same thing He's working on today. Let me show you 5 ways God makes that message undeniably clear in this genealogy. You ready? Here's the first one. My story always has hope because, number 1, the King has been faithful through every chapter. Look with me again at verse number 1 where it says the book of the genealogy of Jesus, Christ. Let me just insert, Christ is not Jesus' last name, okay? Christ is a word that means the promised one or Messiah. So it's not like Joseph Christ and Mary Christ and little baby Jesus Christ, right? Not a last name. It's a title. It's saying that He's the promised one. It says that He's the son of David. He's the son of Abraham. And glance down at verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. From the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, the Messiah, 14 generations. So Matthew's doing something very deliberate here. I don't know if you caught it or not. He's not just listing names. He's actually showing us a pattern. There are 3 distinct movements in this genealogy that he identifies here. 3 chapters of history that has already passed before Jesus came onto the scene. And he identifies them. The first one is from Abraham to David. The next one is from David to the exile. And the third is from the exile to the Christ. And here's what he wants us to see in that. He wants us to understand that God has been faithful through every single chapter of human history, through all those 3 different sagas throughout the human's history that has gone before. And you need to know that Matthew himself understood a whole lot about records, about genealogies, about census taking, about documentation. Why is that? Because he actually was a tax collector, Matthew, the guy who wrote this. And tax collectors in the first century, that profession, that was one of the most hated jobs in first century Israel. Like anybody that was a tax collector, like the people hated them. Right? I mean, it's sort of how some of you probably feel about the tax man in our day as well, right? Like not usually our favorite people. But with that background, Matthew could not be more ideal to write this down. He knew how to work with lists and registries and public records of names. Like, no detail is going to escape Matthew. And in God's providence, that despised man ends up being the one who is entrusted to with the task of carefully documenting the most important list ever, the arrival of the one true king of the universe. He wrote the book of Matthew down somewhere between 50 and 70 AD, depending on exactly how you look at what took place around that time. It's likely in the 60s. That's when I think it probably happened, before the destruction of Jerusalem. He wrote primarily to a Jewish audience. So people who knew the Old Testament really well, and they were waiting for the promised Messiah, like they knew that there was a promise of a Christ coming. That's why all throughout the book you're going to see him write things like, such and such happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Every time he does that, he's carefully building a case for this Jewish audience. He wants them to understand Jesus is the one. He's the one that God has always promised in the Old Testament. That's why he starts with Abraham here on the list, because that's where the promise began, right? All the way back in Genesis 12, God promised Abraham that through his offspring, all of the nations of the earth would be blessed one day. That's also why he highlights David. That's very significant, because in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God promised that David, get this, that he would have an eternal throne. That means that there was coming an everlasting king, one that would never be overturned ever again. And so when Matthew writes Jesus, Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, let that sink in. He's making a massive claim. He's saying, you remember the promise of Abraham, Jewish people? Fulfilled in Jesus the Christ. The promise to David, fulfilled in Jesus. The blessing for the nations, Jesus. The eternal king, Jesus. He's all of those things. And starting in verse 17, look again at the 3 sets of 14 generations that he identifies. See, again, this is very intentional. In Hebrew, letters actually carry numerical value. I don't have a lot of time to spend on this, but the numerical value for the letters in David's own name actually add up to the number 14. And so Matthew is structuring this entire genealogy around David himself to show us that Jesus is the ultimate son of David. He is the king who was promised to reign forevermore. All right, now it's important to understand that Matthew is not trying to give us an exhaustive family tree here. Some people get this wrong. He's actually been very selective on purpose. In other words, the genealogy spans roughly 2,000 years, and if you went back into the Old Testament, you compared this list with some of the other genealogical lists that you'll find in the Old Testament records, you'll actually find out that Matthew left out a bunch of people. Like all of the generations are not listed here. And to be clear, that is not a mistake on Matthew's part. It's not deception. It's because Matthew has organized it theologically rather than chronologically. And he did so in order to highlight the fact that God's sovereign hand has been guiding all of human history straight toward this person, toward Jesus Christ. But the main thing I don't want you to miss is this. These aren't just names on a page, okay? Not only was Jesus Christ a real person in human history, but so were all of these other individuals. Real lives that took place over the course of 2,000 years. And in that span of time, a lot of things went wrong. A lot of kings failed. People rebelled. The nation was conquered. The nation was exiled. There were long seasons of time when God seemed silent, like he had totally ignored his people. And yet, it's clear here, God never lost control. Not even for a moment. Not for a single generation. Not for a single chapter. I read a clever little story this week about an elderly woman from West Texas. And all the people that knew her, they all reported that she would always kind of say the same thing, especially when she would meet somebody new. She loved her state, the great state of Texas, and she'd say, out here in Texas, the land is so flat, you can look in any direction and you can see 50 miles in every direction. And typically the person would kind of be like, wow, that's impressive, pretty cool thing to do out here in Texas. And then she'd sort of smirk and smile and she'd add, and if you want something even better than that, you just take a little short tuna can and you step up on that, and then you can see twice as far. You can see 100 miles in any direction. It's so flat in Texas. And I just kind of laughed when I read that, because that's what this genealogy is doing for us, isn't it? It helps us step up with a little more elevation to see a little further. That's Matthew's point. to see further than our own moment, right? See, this is the problem with most of us. We're so head down in what's going on in our lives right now. We don't have vision for what has happened before, much less vision for what God is doing to accomplish in the future. From where we stand, life can sometimes feel pretty random, to be truthful, right? It can feel kind of chaotic on a day-to-day basis. And so Matthew's sort of saying, no, step up a little higher. Step up on the can. Take a look a little further. I want you to see the faithfulness of God who has been working a plan, a deliberate plan through every generation of the past. I want you to hear this, friend. Your life is not a series of accidents. There are no mistakes. God has been faithful in all these generations before you, and you need to know He is going to be faithful in this generation as well. It doesn't matter who you are. You can trust Him. You can trust Him in this chapter, no matter what's taking place in it, even the parts of it that you don't understand yet. He has never lost control of a single chapter of His story ever before. And when you start to see that kind of faithfulness all through the corridors of history, something else, I think, becomes immediately clear. God doesn't work through perfect people. Aren't you glad for that? That's our second point today. Go ahead and write it down. My story always has hope because, number 2, the King works through imperfect people. Imperfect people. I mean, that's one of the most striking things about the list here. Matthew doesn't sanitize it. He doesn't airbrush the family portrait, if you will. He just leaves the mess. He's like, take a good look at the names. Let's just think about a few of them here. Look who he starts with. Jacob. Remember this guy? His very name means deceiver. Jacob was a liar. He cheated his father and his brother, and he manipulated his way all through his entire life. He's on the list. Can you believe that? Judah. The man whose encounter with Tamar in Genesis 38 is marked by one of the greatest acts of deception and sexual sin and scandal in the entire Old Testament. I mean, think about David, who's on the list, right? The greatest king in Israel's history, sure, but also a man who committed adultery and arranged the murder of a faithful soldier in order to cover it up. And then his son, Solomon, who began with such wisdom, but by the end ended with such compromise, literally building altars to false gods within the nation of Israel. Manasseh is listed here, one of the most violent and idolatrous kings Judah ever knew. Manasseh led the nation into occult practices, incredible bloodshed and judgment from God. I mean, these are not the people you would put on your resume if you're trying to impress us, right? It's not an Instagram reel of perfectly posed and polished and filtered photos. No, Matthew includes all the ugly mess without any filters. He doesn't edit out any of the failures. He preserves all of them. He wants us to think about the reality of these people. It's all very intentional. It was actually an interesting historical detail about King Herod the Great, the ruler at the time when Jesus was born. Herod was deeply insecure about his own questionable ancestry, and so being so insecure, he actually purged a bunch of the names from his own genealogical record, editing out anybody that might make him look bad, any of the people he didn't like in his family tree. It's like he just pushed the delete button. He's like, we don't want to remember those people. He didn't want people to think that he came from anything less than nobility, even though, in fact, he was not from a line of nobility. But if we're honest, I mean, are we all that different? I mean, how many times do we do the same thing, just in more respectful ways? Like, it's a very common thing in our day for people to polish their resumes. It's a real problem in the HR recruiting world because people will stretch the dates, right, of their employment history, and they'll soften the language, and they'll leave off a college where the GPA wasn't quite what it should have been. They'll highlight their strengths and quietly blur out the weaknesses. You know, or maybe closer to home, we only post the pics on social media that make us look really great, right? Even if our lives rarely look like our social media feeds. Why is that? Because we want our story to look and to sound a whole lot better than the reality is. But see, the point is, Matthew doesn't do that. He does the exact opposite. Do you see that? He shows us that the family line of Jesus included deceivers and adulterers and idolaters and murderers. He wants us to understand that God doesn't work through impressive people. He works through repentant people. In fact, make note of this. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. But that itself raises a deeper question, I think, doesn't it? How can a holy God work through sinful people without compromising His own holiness? And what's the answer to that, church? What's his name? The answer is Jesus. Every single person in this genealogy, whether faithful or faithless, they all needed the same thing. They needed a Savior. See, the problem isn't that some of them were really bad people and some of them were really good people. The problem is that they, like all the rest of us, have sinned and they have fallen short of the ultimate glory of God. There were no perfect people on this list. And that's precisely why Jesus stepped into real history, so that he could live the sinless life that none of us could live ourselves, so that he could die the death that we all deserve to die on the cross. He took our sin upon himself. He absorbed the judgment and the wrath of God that we all deserve, so that broken people like the very ones on Matthew's list and like the very ones sitting in this room today can be forgiven, can be made right with God. See, frankly, this is where Christianity is radically different from every other false religion in the world. Because every other message says, in effect, the same thing. All the other religions, they say, try harder, do better, be good enough, earn God's favor. Don't listen to any church that would ever tell you something like that, because the gospel says something totally different. It says that bad people can never please God through good works. What we need is not self-improvement. We need a substitute in our place, a sinless Savior who will take our punishment and pay our debt off in full. That is the only way sinners get into God's family. Not by cleaning themselves up first, not by proving they're worthy, but by simply trusting in what Jesus Christ has already done in our place. And so if you're here today and you're weighed down by your past, you can't stop thinking about all the failures that you cannot undo or the sins that you think disqualify you, I want you to hear this clearly. People just like you are exactly who Jesus came for. Your weakness does not disqualify you, and nor does your ability to be used in the future and receive his blessing. In fact, from God's perspective, broken people who are self-aware of their own sin, they do not block his plan. Quite the contrary, they are the ones best positioned to be in the center of his plan. And that leads me to the third way that the genealogy gives us hope today. My story always has hope because, number 3, the king decides who belongs in his family. All right, let me show you something else here it would have immediately stood out to Matthew's original readers. Look again at verses, we'll skip from 3 to 5 to 6. And I want you to see the names here, that Matthew includes women on the list. Tamar in verse 3, Rahab, verse 5, Ruth, verse 5. And then the phrase, the wife of Uriah, in verse 6. All right, now that might not seem unusual to our modern eyes and ears, but in the ancient world, this absolutely was bizarre, right? Because genealogies almost never mentioned women. And if they did, it was usually to highlight some like noble mother from some prestigious family. But that's not what Matthew's doing here. He goes out of his way to include some women we probably wouldn't have put on the list, right? Women who were at best complicated, if not scandalous and shocking. I mean, do you remember any of these girls? I mentioned Tamar a moment ago. She was a Canaanite who disguised herself as a prostitute to seduce her own father-in-law, Judah, and became pregnant with his twins. That's Genesis 38. You're like, I had no idea that was in the Bible. Yeah, they don't tell you that in Vacation Bible School. That one gets left off the flannel graph board, right? And then there's Rahab. She's a Canaanite prostitute living in Jericho when the Israelite spies came to scope out the city. She hid the spies, she protected them, and ultimately she came to faith in the God of Israel. Joshua chapter 2, go read it. You say, okay, but Ruth, like she's a good girl, right? Well, I mean, she's a Moabite. She's a descendant of Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughter. It should have never happened in the first place. The Moabites were the arch enemies of the nation of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 23 specifically excludes them from even being allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord. But Ruth marries into an Israelite family, and she clings to God by faith, and she's graciously brought in. And what about Bathsheba? You're like, I don't even see that name on the list. Right, because Matthew doesn't even use her name. He just calls her that little phrase there, the wife of Uriah. You see it? Why do you do that? In order to deliberately make us remember the story. Like he wants you to go, like, what's that all about? So that you'll go remember it. And it's really not so much about her as it is about the other guy that we tend to prop up with adoration. That would be King David, who was out on his balcony at his home, and he sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop, and he plots to commit adultery with her, to get her pregnant, then to have her husband, this loyal soldier named Uriah, murdered in order to cover up his sin. 2 Samuel 11. So why in the world would Matthew go out of his way to include women like this on the list when it's not even culturally responsible or relevant in that day to put women on the list at all? Why'd he do it? Why highlight some stories that like most of us, if these were our stories, we'd rather people not know about these things, right? We'd rather keep that covered up. Here's the answer. The answer is grace. That's why. Matthew's making it unmistakably clear that belonging in God's family is not earned, my friends. It is granted. It is grace. Not because of pedigree. Not because of performance. That's not what puts you in the family. How many of you ever worked on one of those like family tree projects where you go back and you look at your ancestry in the past? Anybody? You ever worked on that? A few of you? Okay. My dad worked on one of these projects a few years ago, and it's pretty cool to connect the dots to different people in the past and find out like who's actually in the family. It's sort of interesting. Like if I were to ask you what's the name of your dad and your mom, you probably could tell me that. If I said what's the name of your grandparents, you might be able to get me those. But by the time I get to great-grandparents, just tell me their first and last name. You'd probably struggle. And if we go even one more back, like it's probably hopeless, right? We're typically so short-sighted historically that we don't even know where we came from, much less where the rest of the world came from. And yet, to do these ancestral studies, or it can be helpful to kind of find out, like where did our family origins begin? I read about a lady recently, and her husband started doing one of these genealogical research projects, and they were feeling pretty good about it overall until they discovered that they were actually related to them, the next door neighbors, the family that nobody on the block respected, the ones with a messy yard, the kids who are always in trouble. It's like, oh no, we're actually related to our neighbors. And so when the grandmother of the family saw that, she looked down at the genealogy and she's like, man, I wish we could just use whiteout on those names. But see, you can't, can you? You have no control over who's in your family and who's not. And that's exactly Matthew's point. You and I don't self-admit into the family of God by being impressive enough for him to come and pick us. And neither do we self-disqualify by being scandalous enough. Jesus is the only one who decides who belongs. And the shocking truth of this genealogy is that he includes Canaanite prostitutes, Moabite outsiders, and women caught in scandal. Why does he do it? Because Jesus did not come for people who have their act together. In fact, he's going to say this very clearly in chapter 9, verse 13. He's going to say this, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Aren't you glad for that? See, some of you, you've been carrying shame about your past for far too long, my friend. You can't stop thinking about your own family background. You can't stop recounting the details of the story that you wish you could forget. The parts of your life you wish you could erase. You hope no one ever finds out about. Like you're thinking even now, if these people in the purple chairs knew what I know about myself, they probably wouldn't want me here. You've been made to feel, maybe explicitly by people who said this to you, or maybe implicitly, that you don't actually belong in God's family. Well, I'm here to tell you, along with my boy Matthew, that is a lie from the pit of hell. Make note of this. Grace doesn't ask where you've been. Grace asks where you're willing to go. The same God who wrote Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba into the family line of Jesus, he's the same God that is pursuing you right now in the middle of your story, in the middle of the mess. And when he calls you, listen, you belong, not because you've earned it, but because Jesus Christ welcomes the unlikely and the unqualified and the unexpected. And yet here's where it often gets even harder for us, because sometimes, even though we know this to be true in our heads, like church, that's not news to most of you, right? You know you belong, not because of who you are, but because of who Jesus is. But there's still seasons in your life when this God of grace who welcomes us so freely actually feels experientially quiet in our lives, right? Can you relate? And that's the next thing Matthew highlights here. Write this down. My story always has hope, because number 4, the king can be trusted even when he seems silent. Look at verse 11. Josiah was the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. All right, now those words right there, the deportation to Babylon, they carry enormous weight in the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. Because the exile was the lowest point in Israel's history. Jerusalem, the beloved city, it was destroyed. The temple itself was burned and sacked. The people were carried away into captivity and bondage, and everything that they thought was permanent was gone. There was no evidence for God's blessing. And then came the worst part of all, silence from God. For 400 years, from the book of Malachi all the way to our book today, the book of Matthew, God did not speak to them at all through the prophets. No visions, no new revelation, no words of comfort, just generation after generation after generation of waiting in silence and hearing nothing at all. The book of Psalms, chapter 137, describes the heartbreak that they felt. It says, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. And it goes on to say there that they hung their harps on the willow trees because they asked the question, how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? See, that's how they felt for 400 years. It was tragic. And yet that season does not mark the end of the genealogy, does it? The genealogy keeps marching forward, even through the exile, even through silence. Look at it. Jeconiah had Shealtiel. Shealtiel had Zerubbabel. What's the point? Generation after generation after generation, God was still working out his sovereign plan, even when it felt like he had gone quiet. And I think that's probably something that some of you really need to hear today. Especially you need to hear it because you've been living through your own season of silence in life. You've been praying some big prayers, haven't you? Praying for healing, for your marriage, for your health. Praying for restoration in a relationship, praying for provision financially or in other ways, praying for a breakthrough. And for some of you, it feels like your prayers are just hitting the ceiling. Like is God listening at all? I want to believe God, but I'm crying out, I'm hearing nothing back. And you're starting to be tempted to wonder if he's forgotten you somehow. Or if you even matter at all. Like maybe God is real in some people's lives, but it feels like he's abandoned me, like he's given up on me. Maybe this whole church thing isn't real anyway. Maybe this Jesus Christ was just a good man in history, but he's not really the Lord who, in a personal way, has come to save me. Well, listen, friend, if that's you, I want you to hear this very carefully. Matthew has an important message for you to hear. Silence is not evidence of absence. It is not. Write this down. Silence is not absence. It's God rolling up his sleeves and moving toward you to work out his plan for your good, even when you can't see it. Especially when you can't see it. The great preacher Charles Spurgeon once said that life is like walking into the back of a theater where a 3-hour play is already in progress, and you sit down and you watch just like 2 or 3 minutes and then walk back out. Well, of course, you're going to struggle to understand the overall message and themes of the play. It's probably not going to make sense of you that those 2-3 minutes that you observe, they're going to feel kind of random and disconnected because you didn't see the whole thing. You only saw a slice of the story. And Spurgeon's point was simple. That's what life often feels like from our perspective. We're only seeing a small little slice of the grand story of God that has stretched from eternity past to eternity future. Listen, God was at work long before you were born. You do understand that, right? And he's going to keep on working long after you and I are gone. And yes, there's going to be seasons that we don't understand, but confusion doesn't mean chaos. It just means we can't see the whole story yet. And this genealogy is here to remind us that God is always quietly working in the background. He's never absent. He often does his deepest work, in fact, invisibly, in ways we cannot see or understand. And his call to you today would be to simply wait on him. Waiting doesn't mean he's ignoring you. It doesn't mean he's forgotten you. Here's what we learn from this passage. After 400 years of silence, what happened then? Jesus came. That's what happened. He came exactly on time. He came exactly as promised. The exile did not stop God's plan. The silence did not mean God had given up on them. It meant that he was working in ways that nobody could see at the time, preparing the world for the precise moment when the king would step into human history. And I'm telling you, if God kept his word through exile and silence to bring Jesus the first time, he absolutely will be proven true to keep his word in your life and mine in our generation as well. Listen, he sees you when you're waiting, okay? Some of you have been waiting a long time for the thing you're praying about. He sees you. He does hear you. Keep praying. Pray again. You say, I did. Pray again. Keep praying. And when he seems silent, it's not because he's distant. It's because he's at work in ways you and I cannot see. And that brings us to the final truth Matthew wants us to see in this genealogy. Last point today, my story always has hope because, number 5, the King secures my hope in Jesus alone. Now we come to the climax of the genealogy. Look at verse 16. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. I wonder if you noticed the shift that took place right there. Did you see it? For 41 generations, the pattern has been exactly the same. Every time it said, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. But all of a sudden, when Matthew gets to Jesus, he doesn't say it like that. The pattern breaks. He doesn't say Joseph was the father of Jesus. He says Joseph was the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. Okay, that switch to passive language is very deliberate on the part of Matthew. He's pointing to the virgin birth, the fact that Jesus did not come into the world the same way that everybody else comes into the world. Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit of God, born of a virgin. He was the God-man, we say, meaning he was fully human, yet he was fully divine at the same time. He's not just another link in the chain of ongoing human failure. He's the one who came to break the chain, to reset the pattern. And everything and everyone in this genealogy has always been moving straight toward him. 42 long generations, 2,000 years through promise and failure and faithfulness and faithlessness, exile, seasons of obedience, seasons of rebellion. All of it was leading here the whole time straight toward Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the Son of Abraham, the promised King of the entire universe. Matthew's message is unmistakable. Ultimate hope is not found in your story or mine or anyone else's. Your hope does not lie in your family background. It has nothing to do with how notable or shameful it may be. Your worth is not wrapped up in your resume, as impressive as that may be, or your long rap sheet that you're embarrassed about. Your standing before God is not determined by your performance in any way. As we sang this morning, hope is found in one person alone. Say his name. Jesus. His name is Jesus. See, if you anchor your hope, if you root your hope in anything that you do or don't do, I'm telling you right now, you're going to live an anxious life because you will never feel like you can do enough. You'll live in shame or you'll live in pride if you think it's about what you can accomplish. If it's built on anything other than Jesus Christ himself, you're never going to have peace in your life. But when your hope and your entire identity is Jesus himself, then you know you're loved because of what he has done, not because of what you've accomplished. And that sets you free. Do you understand? Free from shame, free from striving, free from fear. And that's the final word of the genealogy. It's not about you earning your way into God's family. It's about Jesus securing a place for you through his life, death, and resurrection in your place. And you know what's remarkable about all that? Every single person in the genealogical record here, the kings and the outcasts, the faithful, the failures, the impressive, the scandalous, every single one of them, no matter how wealthy or poor, they all needed the same thing. They needed the hope that only Jesus can provide. And so do we, friends. If you've been trying to build your life on anything else, on your own goodness, on your own accomplishment, I'm telling you right now, what you need instead of that, set that aside today. What you need is Jesus Christ. If you've been crushed down by the weight of your failures, you need Jesus Christ. Because the message of the gospel is not do better. It's not. The message of the gospel is already done. Amen? Done by Jesus. And your only job is to believe in him and to follow him every single day of your lives. It's not even, remember the old bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Now go and do that. No. It's what has Jesus already done? Now believe that. That's the gospel. Do you understand? So here's my question for you as we close. Where is your hope today? What are you trusting in? What's your identity rooted in? Because the genealogy is making one thing crystal clear. Hope is not found in either the good or the bad parts of your story. Hope is found in Jesus' story. And that's what Matthew wants to unfold for us in the chapters ahead. If sin could not stop God's plan, if exile could not stop him, if silence could not stop him, if scandal could not stop him, if none of that could stop Jesus from coming the first time at precisely the moment that God had planned, then guess what? Nothing going on in your life can stop him from coming after you either. He's coming, friends. My story always has hope because no sin or setback in history could stop the King. And that King's name is Jesus Christ the Lord. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for even a genealogy, even a list of names, because every single name on this list reminds us of our great need for you and our great hope that can be found in the person of Jesus Christ. May we leave today encouraged but challenged to not place our hope in lesser things, to not think that our lives are going to improve first and foremost through our financial accomplishments or our worldly pursuits, our ability to seize power or to gain relationships or even to experience great pleasurable moments, Lord. Those are all lesser things compared to the main thing. We need our identity to be wrapped up fully in who you are, not in who we are. For without you, we are hopeless. You give us purpose. You give us meaning. You are life itself. And without you, we will cease to live in this world as you would like us to, much less in the next. We'll be doomed eternally, Lord. And so would you shake open the blind eyes of some people today who have never fully placed their trust in Jesus Christ alone? Would you pound their hard hearts with the hammer of your word and soften it that they would receive you today? But not just those who would be lost today, Lord, but those who would claim your name. Would you remind us? Would you tenderize us to this reality that our job is to walk out of these doors every week firmly rooted in who Jesus is so that we will live out the message of the gospel in everyday circumstances before the watching world? That we would be committed to your mission, not because it's going to look impressive for us, but because how can we do anything less than give you our all after all you've done for us? Thank you for coming for us, Jesus. Thank you for marching through the corridors of time, all the way down to the year 2026, all the way to Odessa, Florida, all the way to Keystone Bible Church, to our seats today where you give us hope. The same hope that you've offered for generations before us. Change us today, God. We love you. In Christ's name I pray.